Hello and welcome back to Scottish Independence Podcasts. This week's episode comes from the climate justice show Rising Clyde and concerns Grangemouth, or Scotland's unjust transition. If you'd like to watch the video version of this episode, it's available on Independence Live's YouTube channel.
Today, Petroineos, which is the employer, the main employer who operates the site, employs 500 people directly. But the site, of course, has many more, in actual fact thousands more, contractors and supply chain jobs and everything. So a recent economic impact assessment carried out by PwC showed just shy of 3,000 jobs reliant on the site's existence. And that's purely the refinery.
That was a little glimpse of the campaign to save Grangemouth over the last year. To talk about all this, we're very pleased to have with us Rosie Hampton. She's the Just Transition campaigner at Friends of the Earth Scotland. She's done a huge amount to build bridges between the climate movement and the trade union movement. And Ewan Gibbs, who describes himself on the Glasgow University website as a historian of industry, energy, and protest. I think that's right. Is that right, Ewan?
Yeah.
And probably done more than anybody in Scotland to recover the memory and the experience of previous energy transitions here, particularly the end of the coal industry, and to think about how those apply to the challenges ahead of us. So thank you so much to both of you. There's a lot to talk about here, so let's try and break it down into maybe three parts. Let's start with the situation now. Assuming we don't have any major change in the situation, any major intervention, what's going to happen over the next few months, and what does that mean for the industry and for the climate, for CO2 emissions, and what does it mean above all for the community and the workers? Rosie, do you want to kick us up on that?
Sure. So I think if we see the kind of continuation of Ineos's plan to convert the refinery, it's essentially a massive failure for Scotland in terms of any measure of a just transition in both industrial and climate justice terms. You know, there is nobody in the environmental movement who should be or can celebrate this. Ineos are still importing the same product that they otherwise would have refined previously. So they've admitted themselves that this move just offshores their climate emissions. There's nothing to say that this is part of a decarbonisation or a kind of energy transition agenda. The people that lose out as a result of this decision are the workforce and the community around it. And if Ineos are kind of given carte blanche by the Scottish and UK governments to behave in this way, then we're likely to see the same thing across Scotland with other kind of major employers industrially and kind of, you know, at major polluting sites, whether that's Peterhead or Mossmoran. Like the fact that they've kind of been enabled by an apathetic Scottish government to get away from this is really damning. So, you know, if there isn't a serious move to rethink the immediate closure of the refinery and engage properly with Unite and like a worker-led plan for transition, then, yeah, I think it's a really shameful set of affairs, essentially.
Yeah, thanks. Ewan, does this feel to you like a repeat of what happened with the coal industry, or is it a really very different situation?
Well, I think the major distinction with the coal industry and the steel industry is who's making these decisions. The refinery Grangemouth, as we mentioned, is owned by Petroineos, which is a company that's a joint vehicle owned on the one hand by Ineos, a privately owned petrochemicals company and refining company that's primarily owned by and controlled by Jim Ratcliffe as the chief shareholder, and PetroChina, which is a subsidiary of one of the biggest oil companies in the world, which is a Chinese state-owned oil company. And so these key decisions are not being taken by government in the same way that they were with the closure of the coal industry. On the other hand, there are very, very obvious parallels. It's not an accident that the Keep Grangemouth working campaign, the campaign led by the workers in the Unite branch at the refinery, has said that the refinery workers are not willing to be the coal miners of the 21st century. They're looking, at this closure, which is happening around the same time as the 40th anniversary of the the miners' strike, and thinking about what happened in the settlements that surround Grangemouth and former coal mining settlements like Bowness and West Lothian, where many of the Grangemouth workforce come from. I think there's also another parallel that we're talking about the closure of essential energy infrastructure and the further loss of public control and influence and domestic control and influence in Scotland, which is being exposed through these decisions. And I think it's also really important to stress that, a lot of time has passed now since November 2023, when Petroineos publicly announced its intention to close the refinery. I did research with my colleague, Ryoko Shibe. We wrote a report for the Just Transition Commission, which your listeners can find on the JTC website, called Grangemouth Workers' Perspectives. And we interviewed and spoke to workers a year ago who were keen to develop a viable transition for Grangemouth to use their skills. And frankly, that window of now a year has passed, and now they're facing losing their jobs and being dispersed. And the Scottish economy is facing a great loss as well. And frankly, Scottish society is facing a great loss. Like, what is the message that comes from dispersing highly skilled workers potentially around the world and stating that we don't value them? These people should be central to a transition to a greener and more prosperous society.
Okay, let's look a bit more at the response from the government, both in Westminster and in Holyrood. Actually, just before I ask you how you see that, let me just play this other clip from Chris Hamilton, the Unite convener at Grangemouth.
There's been conversations about potential buyers. Again, that's not come to fruition. And of course, I suppose the biggest frustration for us as a workforce is the government intervention, or I should say lack of, because there was a general election campaign, of course, in July last year. The Grangemouth refinery in the future, it was a massive issue dominating not just this constituency but the neighbouring constituencies. The incoming Labour government did stand on a ticket of intervening and saving the Grangemouth refinery. We've got
Did they say that?
We've got footage of Anas Sarwar on national TV saying he'll put hundreds of millions of pounds in and he'll save the jobs. So there's a growing frustration here of the promises that were made. And I should say, not just by the Labour government. Let's not forget that the closure was announced under a Conservative government. They sat on their hands with this issue. And unfortunately, I have to say the Scottish government have also been almost missing action on this issue. So it's been, as I said to a number of people, the Grangemouth workforce aren't frustrated through a lack of intervention because we somehow thought we were entitled to it as some sort of unqualified entitlement. We're angry because it was promised and it was suggested and it was said, and like I say, people voted on the basis of that in some cases.
So as you said, Ewan, these are decisions made by private companies, not by the state as such. But missing in action, is that a fair summary, do you think, of the two governments' positions?
Absolutely. And, I think it's particularly shocking given the public-spirited and innovative campaign that the Grangemouth workers have mobilised over the past year or so. I attended an election hustings, actually, which was well attended in the Alloa that was held in Grangemouth by the campaign for the Alloa and Grangemouth constituency. It included both representatives from all the major parties. Brian Leishman, who was ultimately elected as a Labour MP for the area, reiterated the position that Chris has explained there. To be fair to Brian Leishman as an individual, he has continued to campaign for intervention and, a publicly led response to the closure and transition plan. But he's unfortunately been isolated. In the immediate aftermath of the election, Ed Miliband, the new Energy Secretary of the UK Labour government, came to Grangemouth and seemed to be instigating some sort of renewed programme of public intervention. And he appeared to be doing that in concert with the Scottish government. Gillian Martin, the Energy Minister, was part of that too. I think ultimately the major flaw in this whole process was we're relying on private companies and foreign state-owned enterprises to take actions in the interest of Scottish workers and communities where these interests are fundamentally at odds with one another. And I think it's also important to stress, as Rosie has already underlined, that the decision to close the refinery is not being taken on a transition ground. It's not being taken to reduce emissions. We're simply going to import refined products from around the world, which is something we're already doing, which raises considerable questions about energy security, but also ethical questions about the environment and our meaningful commitment to actually transitioning, which Grangemouth could be a central site for, but instead we're going to let that potential go at the moment, in no small part because of a lack, seemingly, of well-run initiative on the part of government, and a continued commitment to a failed privatised market-led energy model, which your viewers and listeners have already suffered the consequences of in huge energy price rises in the last few years.
Yeah, Rosie, I mean, how do you understand this failure? I'm thinking particularly of the Scottish government, although I know it's a reserved, it's not immediately their responsibility, but they seem to have not stepped up to what might have been expected of them. How does that fit into the Scottish government's approach to a just transition at the moment, you think?
Well, I think Chris put it best by saying that they've been completely missing in action, which is embarrassing, given that, even if you want to kind of trace it back to a particular moment, which I'm going to describe, but, the climate crisis has been ongoing. The writing has been on the wall for a long time for the need for proper transition planning, investment, and pathways and support for workers. This is not something that should have caught them on the back foot, and that's true on a kind of structural level. But it's also true because they were aware of this as an option at Grangemouth in February 2022. The story broke that the then Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson had communications from Ineos to say a conversion to an import-export terminal was one of the things they were considering. And yet we saw no plan for Grangemouth. We saw no kind of material support for the workers. We saw no kind of, public anything on it, bar like one inquiry by one Scottish Government committee, which Ineos refused to give evidence to, yet there's no kind of public outcry about that. So there's just been constant points along the way where they've had it in plain sight in front of them to do something about, and they've refused, which would be embarrassing in and of itself and very shameful. But what's worse is that they continue to give public money to Ineos with no kind of conditionality, which it's ironic. I was reading the draft of their Scottish Government plan for Grangemouth last week, and you would think it was written by a kind of abstract stakeholder who doesn't have the power of a Scottish Government. It said that they were going to develop conditionality for public money. Well, stable door, horses bolted. You've already given it to Ineos, who have behaved in exactly the antithesis of what a just transition should look like. They've had Scottish enterprise grants. Project Willow, for example, is another example of essentially very kind of shady terms, secret terms and conditions of public money going to the private company that has already proven that they've got no interest in a genuinely just transition.
Explain a bit more about that Project Willow thing, because I think that's a part of the jigsaw puzzle that most people don't know much about. Does it make a difference?
Sure. Well, the short answer to that is definitely not. It's £1.6 million of funding from both the Scottish and UK governments, which has been allocated to figure out what the long-term transition options are for the general industrial complex. It has been given to Ineos, who have then kind of commissioned EY, the consultancy firm, to do this kind of work. But it does nothing for the workers who are actually employed at the refinery in the short term, which is baffling, because I don't really understand why that money needs to go towards the company themselves to then commission out, rather than look inward at what the workers are saying right now about what the transition plan could be. So it's just another way of kind of enabling a private employer who's proven time and time again that they can't be trusted. And this kind of laissez-faire, apathetic attitude of the Scottish government is just pathetic in comparison. There's any claim that Scotland is a leader in terms of just transition, you only have to look to Grangemouth to see that couldn't be further from the truth.
I completely agree with Rosie. I think it's worth saying that the Scottish Government has also been guilty, I think, in many respects, of rejecting its own good, the own good advice that it's received. The Just Transition Commission, which is an independent advisory body, has been flagging the dangers around, public money and the need for conditionality. I think also the Just Transition plan for Grangemouth, the draft that Rosie mentioned, is written as though this closure is not imminent and happening. Like, hundreds of workers are facing losing their jobs in a matter of weeks right now. And this plan is frankly inadequate in meeting that occasion. It's written as a quite speculative long-term plan, and it frankly just reveals the powerlessness of an approach that hands agency to private investors, where our job, if we want, as the state or the public sector, is simply to hopefully massage that behaviour in a relatively favourable direction. We need a far more public-centred approach to that. And I think part of the risk with this as well is the dangerous over-reliance of the Scottish Government on consultancy firms. Like, we've already mentioned PwC and EY as having been commissioned to write key reports here. Why is the Scottish Government not building internal strength to do this? And why isn't it doing more work, say, with relevant universities or Scottish institutions and academics, instead of outsourcing this sort of work to consultancy firms that are naturally orientated towards market-based solutions in big business? Like, that inherently limits the capacity of government and also the sorts of ideas that are likely to entertain.
Yeah, or indeed looking at the workers' own plan, as you mentioned, Rosie. Yeah,
absolutely.
Which I wanted to have a look at here. Here's Chris just one more time talking about how they see a possible transition to producing sustainable aviation fuels.
For a just transition to be delivered here at Grangemouth, there needs to be a realisation that this refinery needs to continue in some form. It can't be a cliff edge closure and an unjust transition as well. It looks like we're heading to. So we've called for an extension, invest and then transition. The question was always going to be, what is that transition? What does that look like and where could we go for there? And what the United Union has done is they've come up with a plan which is almost in tandem with the UK government's SAF mandate, which by 2030 they're suggesting, or they're mandating I should say, that 10% of aviation fuel should come from the SAF base and not fossil fuel based. So therefore Unite sat back, they went, well, there's a mandate for this future fuel, it needs to be manufactured somewhere, why not produce it here at Grangemouth? We've got the highly skilled workforce, we've got the infrastructure, the site today already makes aviation fuel, we've got the customer networks, so it's a no-brainer in the sense of, let's not just import this fuel, because this isn't a question of, is this fuel coming? The government's mandating that it will come. We've got airports returning and saying they are ready to use this stuff. It's a question of where we're going to produce it.
Ewan, I don't know how much you've been involved with at all, the talks around that plan, but how much does it seem to make sense to you from the workers' point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I've not read the plan. I'm also not an engineer. I'm a historian and a social scientist. But I think what's important here is that workers have shown the initiative, workers in their union, to come together and to develop a serious, credible plan. And it's currently sitting on the desk of government that would keep the refinery open, that would move towards a greener form of manufacturing, and that would use the advantages that Grangemouth has, that Chris mentioned. Grangemouth is at the centre of a series of pipelines that people might not be aware of, that they rely on every day. Like, Grangemouth is connected to the North Sea industry, it's connected to Mossmoran site in Fife, it's also connected to other refineries and petrochemicals plants in England as well. Any, I think, plan for the future development of Grangemouth would have to use those strategic advantages, along with the major strategic advantage of the skills of the workforce. Now, this plan has been developed and it should be being advanced. And it should be part of a conversation of options for Grangemouth that look towards, a future beyond refining oil, towards greener forms of manufacturing, whether that involves SAF or green hydrogen or other options. That should be the sort of discussion we're having about Grangemouth. I think the other thing I would add, and I understand there are discussions to be had around SAF, for instance, is the workers have developed this plan in tandem with the framework that the UK government has developed for transition. So arguments around SAF, for instance, to me have to be phrased in those terms, in terms of if we don't want to go down that road, it's about shifting the UK government plan and then amending the plan for delivering jobs at Grangemouth in that context, not turning on the workforce who have developed a credible plan within that framework. Right.
I mean, as you indicated Ewan, I mean, there are people in the climate movement who think sustainable aviation fuel is a bit of a fantasy, basically. And it's so anyway, I wanted to get a bit more into that, but I spoke to Finlay Asher, who's an Scottish aviation engineer who's been very active in the climate movement around decarbonising aviation, and he had a slightly more nuanced take on that. Let's have a quick listen to him.
The future of Grangemouth is a really important trade union issue in terms of the fight for jobs. It's also really important in terms of industrial strategy for the UK. I'm an aviation worker, and Grangemouth provides jet fuel to Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen and Newcastle Airport. So it's perfectly placed to provide the fuels of the future, alternative jet fuels that can help my industry decarbonise. Now, at the moment, there's different fuels being considered for Grangemouth, different options put forward. One of them is the easiest to do technologically. It's called HEFA, aviation biofuel, and it uses waste oil and fat as a feedstock, mostly used cooking oil. However, there just isn't that much used cooking oil in the UK and the world. We already import the majority of what we use for road transport biodiesel today from China and from Malaysia. And they already export more than they collect. So there's a really big risk that there's fraud in the supply chain and palm oil is being used, which leads to deforestation. As Michael O'Leary, the CEO of Ryanair, has said as well, there just isn't enough used cooking oil to power aviation for one day. So we really need to look a bit wider than that if we want a sustainable and scalable fuel that will genuinely provide jobs at Grangemouth for decades to come. We'd like to see the UK government look a bit wider. It needs to consider more scalable fuels such as electrofuels that would make use of, the North Sea offshore wind potential there. We could produce green hydrogen potentially in Grangemouth, and we could test out different technologies and fuel production processes, making use of the skills, the talents and the expertise of the workers and helping to retain jobs there.
Yeah, so there is clearly some slightly different points of view and approaches to this issue. But as you said, Ewan, that debate doesn't seem to be happening. So I'm wondering, Rosie, I mean, is the climate movement ready, prepared to engage in that debate? How do you organise a worker-led transition for Grangemouth?
I think it touches on something that Ewan said, which I think is really important about how, yes, the kind of site-based worker-led transition are crucial. It's a key tenet of, workers being involved in the futures of their industry and kind of leading from expertise and experience. But without that kind of coordinated approach, which really needs a kind of coordinating strong arm of governments, local authorities, you're really operating within a restricted terrain. So like Ewan said, the Grangemouth workers are operating within the constraints of SAF mandates and thinking about what is realistic. Then they're also kind of working within, kind of the Scottish government context as well. And I think that's something that within the climate movement, when we're thinking about how to be serious about what industrial demands for just transition are, we also need to be thinking in those terms too. And that means making both site-based arguments, but also kind of scaling them up. So I think one of the things that we try to lead with is that when we want to see good jobs for workers in these industries, one of the primary things is about job security. And if we think about aviation as a sector in general, yes, there will be ways in which we can kind of, think through the fuels that Finlay mentioned in his clip. But there's also questions around general demand reduction for, really carbon intensive ways of travel, like driving, like flying. And is that an industry that is going to be sustainable for the very, very long term for workers and things like that? So there needs to be all of these different conversations joined up and a much more coordinated approach, because it's one thing to think about what's going to help us in the next 10 to 20 years. But if generally we're moving to a place with much less air travel, much less cars on the road, then we want to be thinking about genuinely sustainable options, which I don't think that conversation is there. So we're kind of in the middle of like a rock and a hard place, honestly. Well, we're not. I wouldn't say the climate movement is. I would say the Scottish government and UK governments are, where they're not doing enough to address the very short-term situation with workers about to lose their jobs. But they're also quite short-termist in their thinking about quote-unquote solutions, because the longer term with, targets around demand reduction for aviation in general, the Scottish government have targets around, how many cars are on the road. None of this is kind of coordinated in the way that it needs to be. And I think that sort of working across the climate movement needs to be, mirroring that lack at a kind of government level and saying, we have these answers. We're coordinated across worker-led movements, across trade unions, across groups that are demanding a just transition in aviation, all the way to those who are kind of moving to work in renewables and offshore. There's just, these things need to be connected, because otherwise you really risk people having to work within restrictions and feeling quite atomized and alienated because of it.
I mean, it does pose a dilemma for the climate movement, does it not? I mean, I feel like that myself. A year and a half ago, or a bit more, I was at Climate Camp Scotland, camped outside Grangemouth. And the whole point of the camp, basically, was to demand the closure of Grangemouth. But now, of course, the same activists are trying, most of them anyway, to support the workers at Grangemouth. And that looks like a conundrum, right? Just a couple of weeks ago, the 5 activists from This Is Rigged in Glasgow, who had occupied part of the Grangemouth plant back in 2023, were up in court, at the Sheriff's Court in Falkirk. Rosie, do you feel this is a dilemma, a kind of contradiction? In a sense, I mean, the climate movement is having to kind of make a kind of about turn somewhat on this question. At least it looks like that. How do you kind of explain that to yourselves and to other people?
I don't necessarily see them as in contradiction with one another. I think when activists take the move to kind of occupy or disrupt infrastructure, I think This Is Rigged in particular, we're very clear about the demands being levied against billionaires like Jim Ratcliffe and levied against the institution of private energy in general, rather than the kind of downplaying from the workforce. And I think there's a bit of an ecology of the climate movement in, you have people kind of doing that direct action work, which, if it stops Ineos's profits for even an hour, that is a useful intervention in that system. And you can also simultaneously be doing that kind of long-term work with workers and kind of thinking through how to support their transition plans and kind of bringing that together. Because I'm always wary of kind of pitting those two things at odds with one another, especially in a context where, as you've said, those people are now up against a very repressive state, which is clamping down more and more on these sort of acts of protest, because they're known to be effective. If they threaten capital, they're effective, and that is part of it. And I think actually divorcing the interests of capital from the interests of the workforce at Grangemouth is a crucial task of any kind of organising for a just transition. And I think direct action and investing in worker-led plans exemplifies that point. So I definitely think it's a difficult one to articulate in terms of, getting it on, communicated to a broader audience, communicated to workers as well. But I think when you actually drill down to the nuts and bolts of what's going on, those two things are not in contradiction with each other and are working from the same playbook. So I think it's very reasonable to see the same people who were outside Grangemouth in 2023 saying no to Jim Ratcliffe, mass profits, like Grangemouth, needs a transition plan. That is still within the same vein of organising as the same people being on that march last summer to say, pause the closure, think about a transition plan. I don't think those are two contradictory positions, and I actually think communicating that is a really important part of our general organising project.
Ewan, the conversations you had with workers at Grangemouth over the last year or so, does that relationship with the climate movement and the climate crisis, indeed, more generally, does that come up? Is that an issue? And how do they see it? How do you see it, that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, Ryoko and I were very lucky that workers spoke to us. And they spoke to us mostly in about a year ago, so sort of February, March last year. And that was the context of after the closure announcement, really before the union campaign had begun. So I really didn't feel the workers were recycling positions they'd heard elsewhere. And we asked them about climate change and the environment. And Firstly, I want to say that these workers are not climate denialists, and they're energy workers. They understand how energy systems work, and they understand their relationship to the environment. And they were very keen to be part of a transition towards greener manufacturing. They articulated scepticism towards current plans for just transition in Scotland because these plans are not fleshed out. They don't see where their jobs and their futures lie in them. But they were overwhelmingly in favour of a plan towards a greener and more sustainable form of manufacturing at Grangemouth. And the key contingency there was local employment. It's important to note that Grangemouth has been suffering from the impacts of a sustained period of decades of disinvestment and job losses. This refinery closure is the end or another episode in a longer experience that Real Koshibi's research, for instance, has emphasised. You know, the workers I interviewed included younger workers who hope for a future, who served an apprenticeship and taken up highly skilled specialised positions. They also included older workers who experienced the lockout in 2013 when they suffered a major defeat. The trade union suffered significant setbacks. And on that occasion, workers left Grangemouth to go and work in the Middle East or the North Sea or other parts of the global oil industry. And that could happen again. I interviewed workers that are weighing up opportunities to go and work in Asia or in Australia. And in some cases, in greening sectors, because that's where in some cases these sectors are growing and developing in a way that they aren't in Scotland. So, you know, these workers are keen to use their skills and be part of a transition, but they don't see that as on the cards at the moment. They were right about that a year ago, unfortunately, given the picture that they're facing right now.
Right. We're almost out of time, but I just wanted to leave you any final thoughts on this, and I think on that particularly crucial issue of how to combine the climate justice movement with the workers' movement, with the trade union movement. What can and needs to be done in the immediate future to approach that? I
think that, you know, in some ways, from a labour and trade union movement point of view, the same issues here are the issues that we've always faced. That the interests of the community workers in the environment are not the interests of Jim Ratcliffe and Petroineos. And frankly, we need a massive change in government agendas that recognise that and recognise that there's an urgent need for public sector led action to urgently intervene and transform the situation at Grangemouth and to develop a set of frameworks and plans right now that secures the jobs that refinery workers currently hold and sets them on a movement towards greener manufacturing as part of a national plan. And I think that's urgently important for Grangemouth in central Scotland and for the Scottish economy at large. But more than that, it's also important because a much larger workforce in the North Sea industry and in other carbon-intensive sectors across the UK as well as in Scotland are looking at Grangemouth. Grangemouth is a site that is comparatively easy, I think, to transition, in contrast, say, with the offshore oil sector. If this isn't done at Grangemouth, which has been widely spoke of as a litmus test of just transition, it now looks like a clear case of unjust transition. If that passes at Grangemouth, it will set a very pessimistic tone for the future of transition across Scotland and Britain.
Yeah, I really couldn't agree more with Ewan's kind of concluding points. I think from a climate movement perspective, it really hits home that we cannot be campaigning for phase out of oil and gas without concrete just transition demands, taking seriously the issues of industrial policy and building those coalitions forward, because it is so easy for the right, it is so easy for business and industry like Petroineos or elsewhere to say that they are the ones that have workers' interests at heart and either place themselves as kind of the ones who have the climate at heart, greenwashing, etc., or position themselves in opposition to net zero and that agenda in a really reactionary ways. And I think the most powerful thing that we can do is actually build across those two movements and build a really strong core of solidarity that says, no, we are the ones that have the interests of our communities and our jobs and our workforce at heart. And you can't kind of argue against that. So I think it's an insurmountable task, but as Ewan said, it couldn't be more important. And I think we have made progress in that sense. And I think it's just a case of kind of building on it, because if we can't do it, if things essentially like don't pick up from Grangemouth, then we're really risking the same kind of domino effect helping elsewhere from the top down, but I think from the bottom up, and looking at the kind of grassroots organising that's been happening, I think there's lots to resist and build together on that I do have hope for. I think the picture from the Scottish governments, from industry, is definitely one that people can be pessimistic about, but I think the coalitions that are building are one thing that we can kind of draw inspiration from.
That's great. Thank you so much. We're right out of time there, but there's a really, really important point. And as Chris Hamilton said, this is possibly the industrial issue of a generation for Scotland, Grangemouth, and I'm sure it's a subject we'll be coming back to. Thank you very much to both of you, and thank you for listening. This is Rising Clyde. Until next time, goodbye.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can click the little bell and you get a reminder whenever we put out a new episode, which is every Friday.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website. And we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.
And we'll catch you later. Bye now.